Good morning, everyone. I'm Monty Frohar. I'm your moderator, and this panel is going to focus on how we are redefining value and the sources of value, if I can sort of call an audible here, in cell and gene therapies as we move into the next decade. Before we get going, I want to let each of our panel members take an opportunity to introduce themselves, and since you're hiding at the end, Sean, I'm going to make you start.
That's why I was hiding. I'm Sean Marrett. I'm Chief Business and Commercial Officer with BioNTech. Been with the company 8 years, and BioNTech is now a publicly listed biotech here in the US. We're German-based and focused on individualized immunotherapies, which includes CARs.
Hi, is this on? Walt Kotonik. I work at a place called Third Rock Ventures. We are a venture capital firm based in Boston, also have an office out here in San Francisco. We are often first institutional money into any given company. We often incubate companies ourselves. Extreme focus on therapeutics and precision medicine. My background, been with Third Rock for about 6 years now. Have launched a company, been in that company, come back, putting together companies now. Management consultant, chemical biologist by training.
Hi, good morning. Rochelle Jacques. I'm CEO of Enzivant, and at Enzivant we're working on therapies for people with rare and often fatal conditions. Our lead asset is coming from our T-cell platform, which is RVT-802. That is targeted to treat congenital athymia. It's a one-time tissue-based regenerative medicine. And for those of you who haven't heard of congenital athymia, it is ultra rare. It's where a baby's born without a thymus, and as a result, they can't make functioning T cells. So unfortunately, these children pass away. It's uniformly fatal. Most of them die by the age of 2. So we're moving with as much urgency as we can and have an eye toward an approval hopefully later this year. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rachel Harwitz. I'm the CEO of Caribou Bio. We're a CRISPR gene editing company, and we're using a couple of different next-generation CRISPR platforms that are a lot more specific than the first generation to develop gene-edited cell therapies for cancer. Our lead program is an allogeneic anti-CD19 CAR-T going in the clinic in a few months later this year. And we're also focused on using edited iPSCs to derive NK-mediated cell therapies for solid tumors.
Awesome. And as I said, I'm Monty Fruhar, Senior Analyst and Managing Director at SVB Leerink. I cover genetic medicines, gene therapy, gene editing, oligos, sort of nucleotides behaving badly in general. Okay, that's good. We're going to go. Thanks, guys. That's the panel. Probably not. I'm going to start by picking on you, Walt. For cell and gene therapies with a curative intent, sort of one-time therapy approaches, when you think about investing in those therapies relatively early, preclinical, coming out of academia, you're investing in therapies that may require an entirely new payment infrastructure, entirely new pharmacoeconomic analyses to justify value. How do you think about investing that far out when the value capture for the ultimate product, even if scientifically successful, is a little bit unclear?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had some sort of extremely elegant answer. I think that when we're operating at the earliest stages, 10 years, maybe 8 years, best case scenario, from a marketed product, you're going on faith that if we can, have kids who should be dead alive, that's going to be paid for in some way, and we're going to figure out the way to capture that value. I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking on within our portfolio, not necessarily as we're making our first investments, but within our portfolio is how our companies can really be driving that discussion and really putting a stake in the ground, but also doing it in a way where they're collecting input from all of the different stakeholders. And I think that's some of the exciting stuff going on right now. I would argue that in our industry, we have not seen a fundamental shift in the business model since the 90s when Henry came out and proved that rare diseases could be good investments. And I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be doing what we do right now because we are wrestling with the fundamental economic sustainability of what we do. Gene therapy, cell therapies at the forefront of it. Certainly, our colleague Alexis, put some news out there about his new effort. We're going to see iteration on this a ton. That being said, we live in a society that still values health and wellness, and I think for us, first money in, years away from a commercial product. We're investing on faith that we live in that society that values health and wellness. And if we drive an efficient development process, we have good decision making and companies with great culture, there's going to be a positive IRR in there.
So let's take it to a little bit of a broader level. So when you think about where we are from a payer, policymaker, corporate partner perspective, a lot of understanding of the value of a curative therapy, while it seems very simple, how it's captured, what it means in a world where there is no therapy for a very severe indication, as opposed to for diseases where you're replacing an existing, potentially very expensive therapy, isn't always well understood. What can drug developers and us as an industry do to accelerate that education on the part of policymakers about the value of curative therapies? And I'm going to kick this to you, Sean, to start.
Yeah, so in Europe, as you all know, the health economics landscape is very much different and focused on as we get reimbursement. And what's really critical is in order to demonstrate to policymakers and payers is the value of your curative product is to include outcomes measures in your clinical trials very early. And health technology assessments, which are not yet here in the United States in any big way, are part and parcel of what we do in Europe. And they are also a critical component to persuading payers that what they have is value. But nothing, and I agree with Walt, nothing surpasses innovation and providing, dealing with and providing treatments for unmet medical need. Because I agree with you, I think that's always going to be paid for. The only question is how you demonstrate that, which is through the health economics, in our view, and through the health economics route.
And I'm thinking about in the U.S. in particular the existence of 21st Century Cures Act and the RMAT designation are, I think, both evidence of an understanding that there is value to be had, that policymakers do see that there is a compelling value proposition here, even if it's kind of early to quantify it. And I think one of the difficulties that we have right now at the stage that we're in regenerative medicine is we're talking about a value that has a promise of delivering, for example, potentially curative approach instead of a chronic lifelong therapy. And in that case, we haven't, for most therapies, seen the long-term data. So it's still a hypothesis, and we believe in the hypothesis, but it's still, we're still understanding what is the long-term benefit. I think at Enzivant we're a little bit lucky, but we're definitely a one-off in that we do have long-term data, and we actually have survival data for more than 2 decades. This is really, really rare in this space. So some of the things that we think about are quite different from some of what more broadly as an industry we need to address. The other thing that I think about a lot is, early innovations, you never really know how they're going to pay off. And we're, I think, at that stage where we're innovating now, and we have no idea what this is going to mean as we make a shift from an era of chronic, lifelong therapies to potentially one-time curative therapies. What's that going to mean for patients? What will that mean for caregivers? What will it mean for society? I think there's a huge benefit to be had. More broadly, the policymakers hopefully are having more of that long-term view, even if a lot of our discussion today is how do I price this exact therapy today?
So when we think about the other side of the value equation, the producer side, the company side, one of the things that has gotten increasing investor focus is manufacturing and process and the role that has in value. And we're lucky enough to get substantial numbers of FDA guidance documents around various types of cell and gene therapies for different indications. In late 2018, there was a volley of them, which was great for my poor associates. Had to read 400 pages of guidance documents. They loved that, I'm sure. When you think about the value of manufacturing and process becoming having primacy over clinical data early in development as opposed to being an afterthought as it is in small molecules. How does that change your thoughts about investing, when you put money to work, and deciding on internal, fully owned manufacturing versus a CDMO or a combination of the two? And I'm going to start with you, Rachel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a world where we're developing gene-edited cell therapies, the product is the process. The process is part and parcel to actually developing the therapy that can be delivered to a patient. You're right, it's not some afterthought in later stage clinical development. So as an early stage organization, we've built out a full process development team internally, and we've decided that we have to own that expertise and that know-how and that capability. And we do everything from initial research scale work all the way through to developing the scaled-up process, fully optimizing it, and then tech transferring that to partners who have the GMP suites to actually do the material making for our phase 1 clinical trial. I would love to be in a world where we could then own that piece of the process too. Today we're a preclinical company. I think we feel like we need to see some clinical validation before we invest in steel ourselves. But there's no way we could have made it here without having invested in the process and trying to somehow outsource the process in our product space. There's just no way.
I don't, at a high level, and maybe it's just by virtue where I sit, I don't see it as all that much different than what we've gone through with every other modality as it's gone through its implementation phase. Every drug that gets approved is really just a purification fraction that meets some spec, right? And that's not going to be any different. We're obviously doing a much more complicated therapeutic now, and I think we're definitely in that implementation phase. I think for us, as we think about it, a huge part of that calculation about build, buy, some variation on it, some combination is ultimately the scale. We're looking at some really interesting, hopefully transformative approaches right now as we think about what would a true N-of-1 look like. Tim Yu at Boston Children's has really proven this out with Millicin. There's a beautiful paper on it late last year. Lifetime supply of the drug for one patient is in the order of tens of thousands of dollars. We could build a manufacturing facility that could take on that challenge relatively inexpensively with venture dollars. So I think part of this is also solving for what is the ultimate scale of the drug we're delivering.
Sean, I know you want to talk about this. I can just see it I can see it in your eyes.
We have a very clear view on this. You've got to own your manufacturing. And we were founded in 2008. In 2009, we acquired a cell and gene therapy manufacturing business, which we've been investing in for CAR-Ts. The reason is, it's like our mRNA individualized neoantigens, which is not a subject of this panel. It's the same argument. If you're going to do autologous or single batch patient manufacturing, you need to own your manufacturing, period. The reason is you are dealing with dying patients, in our case, cancer. The control of delivery is part of the business model. We believe we will be measured on time in full, consistent delivery of our individualized immunotherapies. And if someone else can do that better than you, then the payer's going to go to the other guys. So you need to control it. And the way we've addressed because we obviously bought it when we were like 1 year old, and the facility, the way we addressed that is we did contract manufacturing and continue to do contract manufacturing, which pays for all of our overhead costs and some of our investments in that facility.
And maybe I can make the contrast, which is you're absolutely right. In the autologous setting, speed is at the heart of it. In the allogeneic setting, in theory, it's on a product that's finished, filled, and in a freezer somewhere. Yeah, and it gives us different flexibility and freedom of thinking. Some of the inputs that we need are, frankly, commoditized already today, but some are not, and still lead to challenges and bottlenecks in terms of timeline. And we still see strategic value there, though I think it's different from what you guys face.
And I think Rachel is right. I agree with you that you did the process development because you can't give that to CMO either.
Yeah, and we're probably, and this I think is a great example of how how early we are and how many different models there are and how we're refining those based on the unique needs. We're a bit, I'd say, a lot closer to your mindset, Sean, just because of the nature of our product. That being said, we do have a partner, but we work with them much more collaboratively than I've ever seen with a CDMO. They're not a traditional CDMO. And I would say we work in almost a 50-50 partnership. We have to in order to be able to keep control of the manufacturing. And it is, we're creating tissue-based therapy for a specific patient. We have to be in the driver's seat there. And there are no experts in this space. And you think about regenerative medicines, and I think there are something like 1,066 at their last count of regenerative medicines in the clinic. Fewer than 5% of those are tissue-based. So there is not a lot of expertise in this area.
So I think that's a great point. So that's a great point. So let's talk about the scarcity and the extent that you feel that you recognize scarcity or not of talent in the cell and gene therapy manufacturing development space. Where are we in terms of the supply of experienced talent on the manufacturing and process side for these products? And how much of a limit, if any, is scarcity of that kind of talent to your development plans, your investing plans, and your clinical development processes? Sean looks like he wants to talk. Come on.
Well, we're a German company, so Germans like manufacturing. And I would say that if you look at some of our processes, actually not on the CAR-T at the moment, but if you've ever been to the BMW factory in Munich, it's absolutely amazing because you get these lorries delivering parts, and as soon as they come off out of the lorry, they go onto the production line. Just-in-time manufacturing. So we've got a base in Germany to really exploit that, and we do exploit that. I think the question for us is one of automation, and what we see with our contract manufacturing in CAR-Ts is everyone comes with their different recipe at the moment. It's like antibodies were 25 years ago. So there's no standard process yet, which makes it harder to automate. But for us now, we plan to enter the clinic this year with our first CAR-T, and that will herald what we've been doing on our mRNA side, which is automating. And a lot of it will be, again, it'll be very, very focused, just-in-time manufacturing principles applied to that.
I think there's probably a difference between talent with respect to the people you might want to hire inside your company versus talent and expertise that resides in some of the CDMOs externally. We've certainly been very lucky that we've been able to put together an internal PD team who come from other cell therapy experience. This is an early field, but it's not brand new. And there are people out there who have that type of expertise. But I think what we're finding is in the CDMO world, there are new needs arising based on these newest therapies that we and others are developing, for which the expertise has not yet fully been built out. And I'll give the example of the AAV6 vector. It's the viral vector that happens to infect T cells the best and is used by many of the allogeneic CAR-T developers today. It's really the first therapeutic need for this viral vector. And so it's the first time the manufacturing industry, the CDMO world, has been faced with a need for it. And so I don't think this is a long-term challenge in our industry, but I think it's a next couple of years challenge as a lot of groups try to figure out how to make it and how to make it at a scale large enough to support the current needs.
You know, from our perspective, because there isn't expertise in tissue-based therapy, it is very difficult to find people who have done this before. So instead, we're looking for folks who have, of course, some exposure to regenerative medicine, and it kind of doesn't matter at that point, but just, a little bit about the mindset and the understanding of where things are in development. But also, we're looking for a lot of behavioral aspects that are really important. So are these folks who are agile and who can learn and who are problem solvers and importantly, who can get down into the details and really execute at the detail level, which is critical, at the same time being able to see the big picture. Because they've got to kind of come in and out of that, which is really difficult for a lot of people to do. And what we've found is folks who have come from a great manufacturing background in more traditional therapies sometimes have trouble adapting to this more agile environment because they're more used to having a framework, a playbook to work with, and we don't have that. So they have to think differently, and they have to sometimes let go of some of the traditional practices. So for us, it's really about finding the right kind of mindset and other skills, and then they'll learn about tissue-based manufacturing.
So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory side of things. Obviously, we talked about the FDA giving more guidance, the breakthrough, RMAT, the alphabet soup of various designations, depending on which geography you're at. When you think about the increased flexibility and open-mindedness of regulators towards adaptive studies, towards rapid paths to market for cell and gene therapy, are there geographic differences, and how is that reflected between your relationships with different regulators and different government and payer bodies, between the U.S., EU, Japan, et cetera, China, and emerging markets? How do you think about that in planning a global therapeutic need? I'm going to start with you, Rachel.
Sure. So I'll say our interactions have solely been here in the United States so far with the FDA and thinking about a U.S.-based phase 1 clinical trial for later this year. But I think already our regulatory team is thinking through what have we done that speaks to the internal needs here versus what will we have to flexibly change to meet the needs elsewhere. So even though we're not yet planning any sort of ex-U.S. trials, our team is already doing that thinking and recognizing that in some cases there are some substantial differences. And I think that impacts how quickly we can think about moving into other geographies with the limited capital that we have as an early stage company.
One of the things that I think is maybe providing a challenge for us is some of the accelerated pathways allow us to get there more quickly on the clinical side. But, we were just talking about manufacturing. It's a little bit more difficult sometimes to get there on the manufacturing side. And one of the things I think is interesting and we're watching is what, of course, they're doing in Japan with a conditional approval, because here we are getting there with efficacy and safety outcomes on the clinical side here in the U.S., but we still have a lot of work to do before we can get to the market. And as I mentioned, for us in particular, we're working on a therapy for a condition that has no other options. Yet we still need to get through some of these hurdles where, if you can imagine being able to apply something like what is happening in Japan with this conditional approval, could we get this therapy to patients at the same time we kind of resolve the rest of those things and really make our overall package into the robust package that is generally acceptable here in the U.S. So I think it's good to watch the different models that are being executed in different parts of the world, and hopefully we'll learn from each other and be able to take the best of everything.
I think it's perhaps also worth pointing out that some of these accelerated paths to approval lead to really interesting opportunities, but also significant challenges on the commercial front. Right, when you start to think about these incredibly small trials, and sometimes a phase 1/2 or a phase 2 is the last trial needed to get approval, it's a substantially shorter development process than I think many organizations are used to thinking through. I think especially early stage organizations that are built around a new platform or a new technology, they're not yet thinking about commercialization when they're planning their phase 1 trial, but at that point perhaps we're already too late. And so I think it's a really unique challenge for this space, especially given the whole purpose of this conversation today, which is we're selling different kinds of products into an evolving marketplace with prices that are unique relative to other kinds of products and will require more creativity, not less planning on that front.
So, Walt, I think in that regard, when you talk about potentially thinking about the order of operations of commercial versus manufacturing versus clinical, and scrambling that versus what's a traditional antibody or small molecule. How do you think about company creation, board composition, how early you hire different members of the C-suite and other senior executives into a company? How does it change company building, and where are the puts and takes as you think about that at the ground floor?
I mean, given all of the different accelerated pathways that a company might have, particularly across geographies, it's often a big anxiety-inducing when you step back and look at things like the first possible approval date. I mean, that can be pretty scary. So I think that's where for us, we have to then do very subjective handicapping on how realistic we think that is, and usually scrambling to find the right talent. Right? I'm certainly not an expert in regulatory paths, but I think fortunately, in the Boston ecosystem, we're surrounded by people who are, and fundamentally, if we have a drug that works, I think there's going to be a lot of excitement about trying to pitch in and figure out how to make it work. For us, though, it really comes down to taking a look on the commercial side, on the manufacturing side. All of it is that first possible approval date. How do we work backwards from there? How do we make sure we have the right people around the table? And frankly, that's it's no secret. I mean, you can see in our portfolio how the boards evolve over time, and it's usually driven by those timelines.
And from a regulatory perspective, I mean, the way that we see it, and in fact, the way that we've experienced it both with the FDA and with the European authorities is on the autologous side, the individualized approach, it's seen as a process, and that's what gets approved because, of course, every drug is different, and that's why manufacturing is so important to hold yourself, because it is the drug actually in the end of the day.
I think, we've had some momentum building on the development side in this space, but probably from an investor perspective, kicking the tires now on the commercialization capabilities and the business model is going to be really important. We're really on the very, very early stages of that, and that's where some new thinking is necessary. You think about just the supply chain aspect and not the manufacturing piece, but the entire supply chain. And you're going from, where you have all of these experts, each doing their individual piece of the puzzle, and, they've developed this specialized expertise over years. Where do you get your raw materials from? Expert, specialized vendors, and then you manufacture it at a CDMO who has that expertise, and then, maybe you're distributing that through some broad distributor with some specialty pharma partners, and then it's going all over for a dispersed care. And we're flipping that on its head to this center of excellence model. And in some countries, center of excellence is the norm, but in the U.S., this is a completely different thing. And now you're talking about every one of those steps having to be handled with a center of excellence, either doing the work or at the core of the work. And, as a company, we're now looking at we have to be integrators of a supply chain that we really never had to play that role. So coming to market means you need to have that already, and you need to make that orchestra play. And if we don't spend enough time on that, I think it's an underappreciated aspect of commercialization success.
So I'm going to go a little off script to a broader question, but I think one that we need to think about as an industry. As we've seen more and more accelerated paths to approval, more flexibility, more openness to creative approaches to data, there's always the risk that eventually there will be a misstep. And while it's very rare to see products pulled from the market due to failed confirmatory studies, et cetera, at least some of us, well, me, are old enough to remember Avastin. So how good are we as an industry at policing overly aggressive management teams or overly aggressive approaches that could potentially result in an event that could harm the opportunity set for everyone, or could be seen as a step too far? And do you think this is a concern for you regarding other companies that perhaps are taking a more aggressive approach and cutting corners that shouldn't be cut? What are the safeguards in place, and are they adequate? I'll start with you, Sean.
Our company has a philosophy which is, of course, like many companies, to focus on the science and the innovation. And even if we have competitors who cut corners, we won't compromise on that, because in the end, it will save you money on average. And I think that's a fundamental driver of our company.
I think we as an industry have to just fundamentally always do the right thing for patients. And I even put this back on you, Manny, as your position. I mean, it's a lot of this follows the flow of capital, right? I mean, in some ways, your role and part of this is policing that as well, to make sure that the opinions out there are consistent with what is right for patients, what is going to be a drug that we know works or a product that we know works. I think that's obviously a really hard thing to prove. I think the other piece of it is, of course, the payer alignment. You mentioned Avastin, and as that label has changed, it continues to get reimbursed by CMS for basically anything. And so I think the other big piece of this is payers are going to be part of that, the value equation, of course, but also the policing of it as well.
So I think that's throwing it back to me. Lovely. One of the concerns that I have, and I see a lot of companies coming through, potentially looking to raise capital in the future, looking for coverage. There's a universe of companies with truly, truly elite, experienced, qualified, very diligent ethical management teams. There's a universe of companies with management teams that are perhaps newer to the sector, but certainly qualified and highly ethical. And then as we see a little bit of a gold rush mentality in some subsectors, there's other management teams who perhaps this is their first foray into biotech. And a few investors and others have raised concerns publicly that, hey, maybe there's a little bit of froth and it falls upon investors and also brokers on my side to provide a little bit of policing there. And I guess the question that I have is, how well do you think we're doing in policing potential bad actors? And is there any more that we could be doing as an industry beyond the obvious of trying to starve such entities for capital? And how do you think about that? Is there a need for a biotech call-out culture, as it would be? Or do you think that does more harm than is good? You're nodding, so I'm going to let you take over, Rachel.
Yeah, I think a lot about some of the ethical implications and questions related to gene editing. And there are all kinds of interesting both national and international discussions centered on who gets to make those decisions, which genomes are okay to edit, why, where, and how. But one of the things that I find really heartening about those discussions is it's not sort of traditional drug developers in the United States who are trying to go rogue, as it were. I think all of the organizations here who have brought on substantial investment to try to move these technologies forward, they're for exactly the reasons that were just articulated. They're for severe unmet medical need. I think we all share the same passion and desire to help patients. Our concerns or our questions come more from folks outside of the traditional environment who may not be looking to their national regulators for guidance, even if they legally are supposed to. And I think that's where our corner of the industry worries, is people outside of the traditional framework and what role they may play in pushing boundaries inappropriately or outside of the guidelines. I think within our industry, there's a lot of trust that we all place in each other, and whether that's in investors to not put money behind something that is inappropriate or unethical, or on people, individuals on teams to recognize that there's a problem and put a hand up, whatever that looks like. I think there are very few examples of this going really poorly for long periods of time, and I think that's a great reflection on our industry.
I think it's an incredibly hard question because who's the arbiter of righteousness, right? Who's to say what's right? Fundamentally, and particularly where we work at the earliest stages of drug discovery, we are fundamentally built to push the envelope. We're dealing with perhaps the most complicated substrate possible, which is human biology. We have to be thinking innovatively, have to be pushing the envelope, but at the same time, we always have to have that North Star of what's best for patients. And I think that's even hard. I spend a lot of time with families who are impacted by various genetic diseases, and as I think about what I would do if that was one of my kids, I think a lot of the playbook goes out the window. I'd do everything I could to possibly help my kids. So I think it's an incredibly hard question. And I actually do agree that we don't have enough of a broad discussion about it, though. I worry about that righteousness piece. Who is the arbiter of righteousness?
I think pushing the envelope on the science is one thing. On other ethical issues, it's another. And we didn't talk at all about boards and their role in this, but to the extent we have unethical players that are known in the industry going into new companies, you have to wonder what the board's doing. And it seems that that's their role as well. I don't think we have a place for unethical players in this industry. We see what's gone on and the reputation that we have. And I think about, it's very frustrating to me because every day I'm working with people and have been for years who are so passionate about doing what's right for patients. Every day in the office, the work that we're doing, the discussions we're having is what's the right thing to do for patients. Yet our reputation as an industry is horrific. And why is it? It's some of this unethical behavior. So I think that should be, pushed out of the organism, and we shouldn't tolerate it. Again, pushing the envelope on science, that's one thing, and then we can have a collective discussion on that. It should be transparent. There should be a lot of room for debate. But on other kinds of topics, it just shouldn't be tolerated.
I think one of the things that's, despite the fact I started with the question, one of the things that's most interesting about these sort of individual scandalous issues, and they happen in the cell therapy world, et cetera, but elsewhere as well, is their rarity, is how sensational it is to even see a single incidence, as we saw in China, of gene editing where gene editing is not supposed to be done. And maintaining that rarity, I think, is very important for our industry. But getting back a little bit on track, on the practical issues of how you produce value in your company, we talked about the manufacturing side, we talked about the importance of process development, and we talked about commercialization early. As those become increasingly important, at what point does clinical trial design and development become subservient to proving out the manufacturing, proving out the pharmacoeconomic analysis, and has the clinical endpoint per se just become one of several endpoints? And how do you think about prioritizing those in considering a very complex clinical trial? And I'll start with you, Rochelle, because you have the most complex and hard-to-find group of patients I can think of.
Oh my goodness! So I'm not sure I have a great answer to that, and I do think that there's a role for gathering much evidence in these clinical studies, beyond just the primary endpoint, and thinking about accelerated pathways. How do we integrate early some of the other kind of elements that we need from a data perspective to be able to support our long-term value discussion? We have to be thinking of that early. It's not necessarily in our mindset today. I think we'll get better and better at that. It's going to be really important as we're thinking about moving outside of the U.S. because those are things that, especially when you think about integrating things like quality of life for patients, for caregivers, as well as productivity and so on. Those are going to be important aspects outside of the U.S. So having a way to quantify them and getting that into the clinical trial design, I think it is important. And so there are things that need to be achieved in the clinical trial beyond just a traditional, reach the endpoint. But I think it's fit for purpose as well. And we'll each need to find what's the right path forward given where we're trying to go, given the nature of our therapy, and given the obvious or not so obvious value proposition that's already in hand.
So, Sean, I think one of the questions that arises there, as we have, as you mentioned, quality of life, patient-driven endpoints, as opposed to the more traditional model where what's important is often driven by a key opinion leader physician, or by a regulatory or by a pre-existing regulatory document. As patient feedback becomes more important in determining a potentially approvable endpoint, at what point does it become a question of physician education or patient education, where perhaps the patients in some of these more uncommon diseases are more expert in their own disease than even the physicians that are treating them. And how do you manage that sort of difficult transition?
Yeah. So I mean, so when we set up the company 11 years ago, we put we may call it a patient-centric company, and that's because, we recognise that each individual's cancer is different. It is, and therefore, if you want to attempt to treat cancer effectively, you have to recognise that. What's interesting is what we've seen is that the patient in the 11 years that we've been operating is becoming much more empowered in treatment decision making. It's amazing to me that I had personal experience with my mother who had colon cancer, and I had a discussion with the physician, and together we decided upon what my mother should get, because I was empowered to do that. And I think in the individualized space, which is, of course, for us, autologous cell gene therapy and our mRNA, some of our mRNA programs, you're dealing with the patient's tumor. And what we found is they're really interested in that. And if you do patient journeys, which is a marketing tool to follow the decision points in a patient's treatment, the influence of patients is rapidly increasing. And I think that creates opportunities in the new commercial world of single patient treatments for biotechs, but it also creates challenges in that you really need to manage your patients, because all of a sudden they're becoming up and equal with the physician. That's our experience.
And I'd say we're already there if we weren't there years ago. I mean, at a very quantitative level, if what we're talking about is making a difference in someone's life, how can we claim to understand that delta we're trying to create if we don't understand the baseline that exists today in a nuanced way? I think the hard part is actually wrestling with the consequences of gaining that understanding and the educational burden it then puts on the company, the investor, the team, to make sure the regulators appreciate and hear the voice of the patient, the KOLs, actually understand the nuance of what those families and those patients are going through. So I think the hard part is the consequence of achieving that understanding.
Yeah, but in some cases in the US, and I have to say I remember when I was working in the US and it was just being introduced, the TV advertising of drugs, I mean, it has created this patient knowledge, and the consequence of that is we really see in the US these very informed cancer patients now.
Yeah, I think this is one area where we don't have to, really make a paradigm shift, because the rare disease evolution is what started that empowerment of patients, and the advocacy groups who are able to also articulate, patients' perspectives and needs. So I think that's good for us in this space. That has already started, but now we're dealing with therapies that are much more complex. And so the burden of educating the patients has, moved beyond just what's your disease about, to now, oh my gosh, what is this new science that we're talking about, and what does it mean, and what kind of decisions do I need to make around that? So we do have, another level, if you will, of education that I think is going to be necessary. 10 years from now, maybe we'll be sitting here at this panel and say, oh yeah, everybody knows that stuff now. But today, a lot of it sounds like, a little bit of sci-fi if you aren't in the industry. But I do think that we have a great ability to build on that rare disease work that's been done in empowering the patient, which is incredibly important.
And I think it's probably important to point out, we're thinking a lot this morning about accelerated approval strategies and being able to move through the clinic quickly, and yet our responsibility to these patients is longer than ever, right? The promise of a lot of these therapies is single-dose curative. It's an incredibly long time horizon against which that is measured. And the FDA appropriately is requiring us to track patients for quite a long time. So I believe the standard right now is if you receive a CRISPR-based medicine, it's 15 years post-treatment of tracking that the company is responsible for. I think that's appropriate and that makes sense. And so there's both this emphasis on near-term speed and opportunity, but also really long-term clinical outcomes, durability, and tracking.
Yeah, the responsibility piece is a great point. I think the other thing that we have to be so mindful is the responsibility we have to these patients. We are obviously aiming for curative, like efficacy, durable therapies. But the one thing the history of rare diseases and rare disease therapy teaches us is that it's always whack-a-mole. We thought we tackled PKU with intense dietary management, and of course, it turns out that that's not the case. We solved that acute problem, but then the manifestation is much greater. So I think the other thing, our responsibility as we immerse ourselves in these communities is to make sure that we're appreciating what the patients are going through over the duration of the therapy, but honestly, the lifetime and how that changes.
I think we're going to see this really play out in the areas where there are going to be options for patients. In many areas, there won't be, but take like hemophilia A. There are going to be options, and how are the patients going to make those decisions? I think that dialogue is going to be very informative to the rest of us.
So I think parallel to this, like I sit on the advisory board of Cure Duchenne, which is a patient advocacy organization for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I know you each have relationships as well. I'll start with you, Walt. When you think about the role of patient advocacy groups in informing company formation, product development, clinical decisions, every step of a clinical program, how important have patient advocacy groups become in cancer and rare disease broadly? But what are the pitfalls, ethical and otherwise, of that close relationship with patient advocacy organizations, as well as with their venture philanthropy arms?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question on their role, I don't know that it's ever been more important. And in a lot of cases, these organizations have quite literally organized the community. So, it's often the first thing. It's the place I start when I work in a new opportunity is immediately engaging the patient group as a conduit into what's going on with the patients and the families. I think the hardest part, of course, is just constantly being transparent and managing expectations. Obviously, if we approach it with the view that we're trying to do something that really transforms people's lives, I think we should be able to get on board with that. But I think immediately we have to also talk about the odds we're against. I mean, there's no secret that particularly in the early stages of drug discovery, probability of success is the variable we have to wrestle with. So I think if we are open about that dialogue and constantly working in a way that we can all be proud of, companies I've been involved in, we go out and way ahead of even having a candidate. We're doing phase 0 studies. We're really pushing forward the nuance and resolution by which we understand the disease. And our agreement and the way we approach this is that if we're unable to actually get a candidate, that data, that learning is the communities. And one of the things I'm proud of is the fact that we've been able to do that now. But I think that approach and that dialogue has to be there from T=0.
I want to echo something that Walt said a few minutes ago, actually, which I've observed as well, which is that often it's the patient advocacy groups who are the most creative and the most willing to push the envelope. So actually the only rooms I've personally sat in where the person across the table is banging the table, advocating for germline gene editing, is when they come from a family with a devastating rare disease, where they're thinking about risk, they're thinking about opportunity, and they're thinking about the lack of access to medicine very differently from the rest of us. It's an incredibly humbling conversation to have with someone like that. And so not only is everything that we do patient-centric, but I think we have to keep in mind their mindset and their approach, and it's often very different from ours.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to something, Sean, that you said earlier about the patient journey being a marketing tool. And I think this is where we need to change that to be the patient journey should be the beginning of everything. And understanding that patient journey is part of all of our development program. It should be, part and parcel to our entire focus of how we're going to develop a product, how we're going to bring that to market, and so on, and what kind of support we're going to provide. But I think that's a big difference between more of a traditional big pharma. Certainly, patient journey gets addressed much farther down the path than where we need it to be, especially in a kind of an era of potentially bespoke medicines.
I think I want to revisit the second half of that question around the challenges of it. There's a lot of scrutiny around, especially in Washington, D.C., and this every fourth year, for some reason, who knows why, around, appearances of conflict of interest, appearances of quote-unquote kickbacks, although not, even if they're non-financial in nature. And to what extent does this very close relationship with patient advocacy groups, the role of venture philanthropy, what safeguards do you need to avoid the appearance of misconduct? I'm thinking of Vertex and the CF Foundation, them exiting their Vertex investment, for example, to avoid the appearance of conflict versus their other investments in CF, for example. And how do you think about safeguards to prevent the appearance of conflict of interest down the road when you do have eventually a commercial product? A delightful problem, but still a problem to have. I'm going to toss it to you, Walt, because you're nodding and thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a challenge, and it starts with transparency. It starts with managing expectations at the beginning. I think it also gets to the point of putting some burden back on the patient group and make sure they're managing their constituency and very clear about why they're doing things. One of the great things about what the CFF has done is it's, of course, taken that royalty stream that they had and sold it, and now they're reinvesting it. And I think everyone looks at that, at least I do, and say that's really on the up and up. That's great. Gets them out of the conflict, of course. So for me, this is one where perhaps the burden we face is making sure we're aware of this and making our counterparty, the patient group, aware of this. And they're being very proactive about it, messaging how they're managing that possible conflict. And I think the good news is CFF has put a good version, a good framework out there is how one might think about that. Every one of these organizations, though, would absolutely love to have a marketed product and be in that spot.
Where you have these one-to-one relationships, it's very difficult you have to collaborate. You have to do it. You have to collaborate. And I think doing that in a transparent manner is important. But how do you avoid that? If you've got one potential manufacturer and one advocacy group, that has to happen, and we see that often in these rare and ultra-rare diseases, at least in the beginning. And hopefully that would change and there will be options, but quite often in the early stages you absolutely need to work together. And there are guardrails. I think patient advocacy, certainly they have a different mission, and there are areas where there are overlapping interests, mutual interests, but each organization has to have its different mission, and that needs to be clear. And in my experience, sometimes, especially with the advocacy organizations, they're a little less sophisticated. Often they're kind of learning the ropes. They don't know their role exactly. They don't know all the compliance guardrails and so on. So there's a bit of also helping them to find their way, or even suggesting they partner with larger advocacy organizations to kind of learn some of that. So there's an education there as well, and development there that comes with time and experience.
So we're coming into the end of our time. I want to thank everyone on our panel. This has been a great, wide-ranging conversation, even if perhaps your moderator has thrown a few curveballs out there. We'll see if I can get invited back next year. But thank you guys for your time and for a great conversation, and looking forward to the next decade.
Thank you.